I had had all the conversations I possibly could. I had sat with the ideas for a while, and I think it was something that one of my friends said is just like, feel like what's in your heart kind of and go with it. Sounds so
Yeah.
cliche, but a lot of times like that's actually what it is. It's like I was having all these conversations and thinking about all this stuff in my mind, but really what I wanted to do was go back. Like that's kind of what it came down to at the end of the day. So I just sent it, really.
Welcome to How I Decided, a show where regular people share important decisions they've made so that we can learn from them in making our own life decisions. Today's episode covers the topic of moving from one city to another, which is a decision that many young professionals may have to make or have already made at some point. You can already start to imagine all the different factors that go into a decision like this: your job, your friends, your family, even things like the weather. In this episode, my guest Adam Callahan and I discuss all these things. Adam and I became friends at NYU, and after graduation, Adam went to work for Microsoft in Seattle. That was about a year ago. But I recently caught up with Adam a month or so ago and found that he had decided to move back to New York after much deliberation. I was immediately intrigued by this decision and was curious about what goes through someone's mind when they're thinking of moving cities. For the start of today's show, I asked Adam about his time in Seattle and what it was like to live there. So yeah, Adam, we met at NYU a couple of years back, and I want to start off with you going to Seattle after graduation. What was that like for you, and how was your time there?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I still think back to those days at NYU when we were just kids, it seems like. So in terms of why I moved out to Seattle, I had done an internship at Microsoft in their product marketing management program and got the full-time offer to return. So for me, it was kind of a no-brainer. Like Microsoft in this program had been like the goal for me since early on in my junior year in college. So when I had the opportunity to go out there, even if it meant kind of leaving all my friends and family back in New York, it was something that I didn't hesitate at all to do. I I would say I didn't realize how much of like an undertaking moving cross country would be, especially moving cross country alone, just because there's just a lot of logistics that go into it and a lot of expenses, honestly, that I didn't really plan for at first that just come up kind of over time. But that's what brought me out there.
And for you to go there, like you said, alone and across the country, how did you manage that, I guess, in the first few months of you being there?
Yeah, I mean, it was tough, honestly. I think there were some personal things going on for me too. Like I actually had recently gotten out of a relationship, so was dealing with that while also trying to just get acclimated to a new place. I think one thing that was really helpful there was that I had some of my closest friends from NYU had actually moved out the year before me, so they were there as kind of a just a natural built-in support system that was really, really crucial in the starting for me, just to have some type of familiarity and some friends to like actually hang out with and talk about things that I would talk about with my friends from home, I guess. But then also the program itself, I think, was a great kind of support system or just base of people because there were 30 kids, all of which who are, the same age as me. And we were just kind of out there to try to learn about this new company and this new role while also being in a new city for pretty much all of us. It was the first time living in Seattle. So I think between those people and the friends that I already had, that's kind of how I tried to make it work. But I would say it was still tough just trying to, find new routines and trying to find new ways of living. That was, I think, the hardest thing for me.
I want to get into what prompted you to start thinking about this decision of you to move back from Seattle back to where you'd grown up and where'd you go into college. You mentioned to me in our pre-call conversation that you weren't feeling like yourself in Seattle, and I thought that was an interesting way of describing it, not just saying like, I don't like this city or something, or I don't like Seattle. You're mentioning you weren't feeling like you. I was wondering if you could get into that and the beginnings of when you were thinking about moving back.
100%. So I think the best way that I would explain this is talking about, I guess, how I am as a person overall. And I'm sure you can kind of get this from me a little bit from our relationship too, is that like I just really value the people around me. And I think the people who I surround myself with kind of really influence how I approach life. And maybe that's bad in some ways, but that's kind of how I've grown up to be. And then I think that starts from like my family too. Like when I was closer to my family and kind of seeing what they do and getting really inspired by them as kind of the youngest member of my family, I think that all played into it. So I've always been looking up to people and trying to use models in my life to help me plan and decide what to do. So I think that when I was in Seattle, I really kind of lacked that, or I just felt like that support wasn't as strong there, just in terms of the people around me and the types of things that the people were doing. So between that and just really thinking about how much I would see my family, like if I stayed on the West Coast for a long time, I think those are a couple things that just made me really start to think about the potential of moving back to the East Coast.
How are you like enjoying yourself in your time in Seattle, I guess, after you kind of already settled in, met people there, met people in your program? I know in our pre-call conversation we talked about the weather a bit. We can for sure get into that because I do think that's important and I don't think that should be overlooked.
So I think there were a lot of things that were great in Seattle, and actually my current roommate now would talk a lot more negatively about it, but I think I found the things that I like to do there. Like I really tapped back into my roots in sports. I was playing basketball a good amount, and one of my friends from NYU, they're actually big basketball players, so would play with him a lot. And I think Seattle really allowed me to get into these type of hobbies and activities that just required less of the constant grind and hustle of New York, which I enjoyed for some parts of it. But then when bad weather hit, which I would say is pretty much all of winter, and that starts honestly like end of October going through like almost April, it was just hard for me to keep good energy when I was going about life there. I think that I found really that for me, seasonal depression is a big factor that I deal with and struggle with. So when it was just cloudy and gloomy for a large part of the time that I was there, I found it really hard to just get on to the things that I wanted to and stay on top of the type of lifestyle that I'm trying to lead. So that was something that was a big factor in how I was a little bit unhappy there.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely speak to the weather too. Ever since moving to Dallas, it's I guess compared to New York, it rains a bit less. It's sunnier and warmer, and it just makes you want to be outside more. And I think that really does inform if you're, someone like you or me who likes to be active and playing sports, and that can have a material impact on your life. So I'm glad we got to talk about that. And you also told me before this call about several strategies that you had in kind of thinking through this decision. So one, you talked about having conversations with people you trust, and then also spending time with your own thoughts and listening to what your body is saying. I think it'd be great if we can get into both of these things and how they played out in your decision making process. So I guess we can start with first having conversations with people close to you.
Yeah, definitely. At around the time I moved, I had just recently switched teams in Microsoft. So I was coming from Microsoft Education team to moving to the Xbox Game Pass team. And I really leaned on kind of my mentors and manager from my first year because they understood who I was. So I talked to them first and foremost about just what they think about me moving and how it could potentially affect my career trajectory, and really got positive response in the sense that my manager pretty much told me like if it's something that I think will help my relationships with my family, my friends, then also like my mental state, then it's something that will also help me from a professional standpoint. So I think that kind of reassured me that this was something that's, although I am moving away from the headquarters of my company, it's not something that's necessarily going to derail my career or my opportunities at Microsoft. So that was, I think, a couple of the first conversations I had. And then really just talked to a bunch of my closest friends and talk them through my thinking. And I honestly did get some mixed opinions as to like what was the best choice for me at the time. I think some of my friends were urging me to be a little bit more uncomfortable. And I think that there's a lot of value in that. And I think I could have stayed in Seattle and learned a lot about myself and learned a lot about just life in general if I stayed there for another year or another couple years. But then a lot of my friends also kind of, wanted me to come back, wanted to see me. And that was something that I think made me a little bit biased going into, is just I knew that I had friends who would be happy to see me and I would be happy to see them. So that made me a little like more attracted to the idea of moving.
Yeah, well, I'm actually most interested, I think, in the ones where they encourage you to be more uncomfortable. Because for me, I hear that, I think of like, wow, like that's a really great friend who's like, selfishly they probably love to see you and spend more time with you, but also kind of looking out for you and thinking about what can Adam get out of this experience more. Maybe tell me a little more about those conversations and how those went.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the general themes there were that I would get a lot from being in person with my team, my now new team on Xbox Game Pass, and really learning how the business works from a hands-on perspective. And I think that's super honestly just true. And I would have gotten that a lot more if I had stayed. I think also just being in Seattle and challenging myself to grow the relationships and friendships that I was building over there, something that they also talked about. And I think that's another one where I couldn't really argue against it. Like everything that they said, it was something that I was like, yeah, that's probably true. I would get like that level of personal development where I'm really leaning into friendships that I wasn't, as close to as like my friends from home. Obviously, all love for my friends in Seattle, but like they're
Yeah.
just not like the people I grew up with and all that. So that was kind of something where it did make me think about it and second guess myself a lot. Like I'm a chronic overthinker, so when I hear like different opinions about things and when I get any, I guess, inclination that my initial thought wasn't the way to go, then I'll think about it for hours on end. Like there were a good couple of weeks where I wasn't really sleeping that well, just trying to make the right decision.
I can see how both points are valid and true, and just because they're true doesn't mean it makes one decision right or the other. But I guess this kind of does relate into the second strategy you talked about, which is spending time with your own thoughts and overthinking stuff. Like walk me through those weeks where you were thinking, like, was it just kind of always on your mind, and how are you organizing yourself during that time?
Yeah, it definitely was always on my mind. And also I was having conversations with people on my new team because of course I would have to tell them if I were to move and had some like I guess mixed reactions there too around like what would be the best for me. And I think overall they were super supportive and I'm so grateful that I landed on this team because I was able to do this move and they were just supporting me through this whole journey. So that ended up being like something where I could feel comfortable that I would still be supported by this new team I'm just joining, which I think was the biggest kind of thing I was worried about really going into it. It's just like I'm joining a new team. Will they just think that I don't care as much because I'm moving? But I think that kind of just from leadership down to like everyone else on my team, they were very much like if this is something that you think will benefit you for this next upcoming year, like go for it, and we'll support you through it. So I think that just helped me sleep a little bit easier. But
Yeah.
before those weeks, it was a lot of playing out situations in my mind of what would happen if I did this thing or the other. And I really just tried to imagine kind of all the best cases, all the worst cases, and thinking through that.
Yeah. Was this all in your head, or were you like writing it down somewhere, or just to get a sense of the practical strategy behind it, or how you were
Oh
making sense
yeah.
of it?
Yeah. So I would write pros and cons lists, and I think I had like a few different ones that I wrote out just for like different aspects of my life. I would write like different pros and cons lists. That was actually something one of my closest friends recommended that I do, and I would just keep calling him and be like, "What should I do, man?" And then he just told me, "Look, like you have to make this decision from like on your own by yourself. So that's going to be something that you need to, I guess, write out and just understand your thoughts about."
I actually want to go back to the idea of pros and cons list, and maybe challenge you a little bit. So I was listening to this other podcast about decision making, and there's this author, Annie Duke. She has this book about decision making, and she's like very against pros and cons lists. And the reason why is because when you kind of list things, it's hard to kind of understand the weight of each one, like which one matters more, that sort of thing. And I've also found with pros and cons lists, I want to make them even, I guess, for some reason, just to make it fair. So I'll just be like adding stuff to either side, even maybe when it's not valid. But I'm wondering, like, what's your experience? Because I think for every individual, it's a unique, whatever way it takes for you to organize your thoughts. People have different ways of going about that. But for you, how did that help you in your decision?
Yeah. I think those points from that book definitely are valid. I would say that the way that I think it helped me think about it was just that I was able to honestly place a weight on each item in the list. So it wasn't just like a blank or not a blank list, but a list with no weight assigned to each of
Okay.
the items. So I would try to just think about what are all the good things that I could get out of New York, what are all like maybe the bad things there, and then like how much does that like weigh compared to like what I'm getting in Seattle.
I also wanted to ask you in this idea of playing out scenarios in your head about best case, worst case? Do you feel like these were realistic scenarios that you were playing out, or do you feel like you may have made the worst case ones worse than it could have been, or the best case ones better? I just wonder how you look back upon that now, after your decision.
Yeah. Well, my mind went right to like kind of did I make the best case kind of inflated versus what is reality? And I think that might be true to an extent. Like part of the reason I moved back is to work on some projects and like pursue other things in my life, like outside of just work. And I think that I was kind of thinking about it in a way of if I come to New York, like those things will just suddenly take off and just become like this the next thing in my life. And I might have just made those realistic expectations a little bit to an extent. But then in terms of the worst case, I think that I definitely also tend to just inflate that like the other way as well. In the sense like I was thinking, oh, if I go back, my team will hate me because I'm not there and like, then I'll get like bad reviews and just kind of fall off the edge in a sense. But I think that was also a little bit extreme and I definitely still feel supported by my team for making the decision I did and moving here now. So I think that like kind of in both ways, I exaggerated and I over indexed on certain things.
And I think it's easy for the mind to just really inflate how different something is going to be, or even like how difficult it is to, even if it is different, how to deal with it. I think we can give ourselves a lot more credit about how we're able to just, even if we say like do move or like do even like switch careers, how we'll be able to manage it and be okay. I wanted to ask you also, can you like recall the moment where you kind of felt like you were decided, like what kind of got you over the hump in the decision making and at the end of those last few weeks?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll first say the moment where it became a real consideration for me because it had always been in the back of my mind. But then I went over to my current roommate's house on one of the days towards the end of the summer in Seattle. And I'd actually just gotten back from a trip in New York where I had like a really good time, saw a lot of my friends and like went to this wedding that was really fun, did all this stuff. And I come back to Seattle and it was raining like the first day I'm back. And I was like, fuck this, like I don't want to be here right now. And then I went to hang out with my friend, and he kind of made my whole perception of like what I have to do in this next year completely flipped because he had already planned to move to New York, and he knew he was going to do it, and he just said like, "Why don't you come with me?" And then I thought about it for a second, and I was like, "Okay, honestly, like why don't I?" And then that became really serious. Then kind of starts that whole process of that I was just talking about me overthinking, me talking to all these people. And then I think the moment where I was really sure, I mean, it wasn't anything like that crazy that happened, but I think I had had all the conversations I possibly could. I had sat with the ideas for a while. And I think it was something that one of my friends said is just like, feel like what's in your heart kind of and go with it. Sounds so
Yeah.
cliche, but a lot of times, like, that's actually what it is. It's like, I was having all these conversations and thinking about all this stuff in my mind, but really what I wanted to do was go back. Like that's kind of what it came down to at the end of the day. So I just sent it, really.
You kind of paid attention to, there are all sorts of different factors that you can pay attention to, right? Like your career, the team, your friends in New York, the people you know in Seattle. But I really like what you said about what do you really want to do and what your heart wants to do. I had a friend actually, when I was deciding whether to go to grad school or not, I had a friend who had this neat trick for me. So he said you have a coin and then one side is one choice and the other is the other choice. And you flip it in the air. And then as it's like coming down, if you like notice that you really want it to like land on a certain side, you should like go with that one.
I love that.
The thing is though, like it sounds really good in theory, but it actually like didn't work for me. Like I think I was still like too like confused and overwhelmed at the time to really know what I really wanted. But you reminded me of that when you talked about saying like, what did your heart really want to do? Because I think that really just gives you the best chance of success once you like head down that path of that choice. If your heart is really into it and you're really committed to it. Now that we've kind of talked through the decision and a bit of the process, what did you feel like you learned about yourself in terms of what you value and what you care about?
Yeah, yeah, I think yeah, again, like an umbrella term for it could be people, but first and foremost, like thought about my family a lot. I think that when I was growing up in Brooklyn, I was so close to my family all the time, and I would always try to like distance myself from them. I would always take the train to school or wherever I was going, and that made it really easy to not really come home a lot because it's not like they had to pick me up from anywhere ever. So I would always be just like trying to find a way to get out of the house and go hang out with my friends. But I think then when I was in Seattle, I realized that kind of having my family close enough to see them whenever I want to is something that I valued so much. And especially as family starts to get older, I had like some of like my older family members pass away when I was in my first year in Seattle. So that definitely just made me reflect on like what's really important in my life and how can I lean into those things. And then being close to my friends and people who I think similarly to me about what they're going for in life was another thing that was huge. Just wanted to be surrounded by people who are like reaching for something more. And that's kind of those are I would say like the two biggest things that fall under that umbrella of people.
And with your friends that you're talking about that are reaching for something more, like what do you think you guys have in common, and what makes that part valuable for you?
Yeah, I was actually talking to my friend about this today. Like, I think it's this idea that a job isn't like the end of your goals. Like, there are more things out there than just like a job you get. And I think there's just a lot more to reach for and like kind of to pursue in life versus maybe people who are just very like comfortable and nothing wrong with this and like comfortable and like going through the motions and like kind of getting to just the next stage and like moving on like that.
Looking back on your decision now, is there anything you would have done differently in this process?
Yeah, I think for me, I really just would have done it earlier. And this just kind of mainly revolves around the financial input of when I did decide to move, because I did have to actually break my lease on my apartment. And that was something where I had to pay like 2 months rent. And I'm someone who like very much cares about all the dollars I spend. So when I had to
Mhm.
do that, it was something that definitely hit me close to home. But I would say that it also motivated me almost to like make that decision worth it. And it acted as this forcing function to like tell myself like I need to make the most out of New York. I need to like get all these things done that I want to do and like just kind of go after every opportunity that there is. And I mean, still working on that, but I think that like it's definitely still a motivating factor. But that's what I would have done differently just to kind of alleviate some of that pressure, is just move earlier so that I could just leave my lease after a year, also leave before I had already started on my new team. So there would just be less of a hurdle to jump there where I had to talk to my team and let them know that I was moving. If I had moved like and I was already living in New York, it wouldn't really be a question. So those are probably a couple things.
I do think though that in that process of making this decision when you did though, I think there maybe were some benefits of that, knowing that you had your team's full support in that and having those conversations. But I do really like the point about wanting to make the most of New York, because that's actually something that I've been exploring a bit on this podcast too, is the idea of making your decision right. So it was like a term I came across a couple months ago when I was just thinking about my own decisions that I've made. And it's the idea that no matter what you choose, a lot of decisions are on par with each other and can be really great choices, but it's what you make of it that's really important and what you choose to do. So would love to hear a little more about what you're currently pursuing in New York City to kind of make the most out of it, like you said, and what are you doing that you felt like you didn't really have the opportunity to do in Seattle?
So I think number one thing for me is just getting involved in as many of my friends' projects as I can. So outside of work, like when I finish my regular job, I love to just help people build things and like kind of get inside the ideas and share in the collaboration of like building a new product or building a new idea. So that's one thing where I've dedicated a good amount of my time. Also, something for me is just kind of leaning into the idea that New York is like a place where people can meet people. I think that that's something that I missed out on in Seattle, or I missed about New York when I was in Seattle. I think I've been meeting like really cool, awesome like people from all different places. So that's something that I'm just trying to do more and more now that I'm here. And then of course like seeing my family actually and like fulfilling like kind of one of the big reasons I moved is to just like spend more time with my family and really just build my new life here after college because there was definitely a transition where I was so used to being a student here, and now I can kind of lean into being an adult and trying to learn about how the city can best serve me.
Well, I think it's weird for NYU students, especially because went to school in the city every single day, and then now you're working, but you're not in school anymore. You're
Yeah,
not a student.
I,
I really love your response about what you're doing now because it sounds like everything that you considered in your decision making process, the idea of wanting to be closer to family, to be closer with friends, it sounds like you're now trying to do that like with more intention. And I think that goes back to the idea of, once you make this decision, really just going after it. And you mentioned being motivated by the least break, but also just in general for the sake of yourself to really just go after things. And I think that's just a key part of decision making in general, I think, is when you're thinking about your options, maybe considering a little plan about what you're going to do, right? Because I think a lot of people think like once they make the decision, it's done, right? They can just start doing whatever. But I think to really hit the ground running like you're doing is takes a little bit of thought and thinking beforehand. I have a little exercise or question I do want to ask you though. So if you had to, hypothetically, if you had to stay in Seattle, what do you think you would have done to improve your circumstances or kind of shape your life in the way that you had maybe wanted in New York?
yeah, I've actually been thinking about that a lot, just in general in my life recently, because I do like constantly just, look back and say, what if I was in Seattle? And I think that I would have really tried to just become like a different type of, I don't know, like grind mentality. Because I think that Seattle like is such a open door in terms of you can do whatever you want with your time. Where in New York, there are a lot of random things that come up that maybe I don't have to go to all of them, but because of like just the social pressures in New York, I end up at a lot of places where maybe I don't need to be. But I think if I was in Seattle, I would have really tried to just get my life down like to every minute I'm spending intentionally. I'm building things that I want to like personally, professionally, and just like working towards something every day. And I think that that's something that I really kind of think I should be doing in New York as well, but I'm struggling to right now. So honestly, I'm trying to do that here, but that's what I think I would have done there if I had stayed.
Do you think it's healthy to think about what if scenarios?
Yeah, that's a great question. I go back and forth in this. I think there are a lot of things that have happened in my life where I think about what ifs and it doesn't help me. Just regrets that I have and things where I could have done things in a way that were better. But at the same time, I think like looking back and reflecting on actions is something that's going to help anyone become a better person. So I kind of am trying to find that balance right now personally of where like I can look back and think about how things could have been differently, but I shouldn't let it stop me from believing that I can grow and improve from that original state. So it's definitely, I think it requires intentionality and a balance of what you're really believing about those what if situations. But I do think it could be valuable. Yeah.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or stuff that I missed that you'd like us for us to go over?
Nothing really. I just want to say like super admirable what you've done and how you made the decision you did. And I think like honestly something I didn't mention, but I did think about how you were making that call actually when I also moved to Seattle. Like I thought about what you did as part of like this is part of my long overthinking process. So yeah, it was really cool to see you do that.
Appreciate it, man. And thank you for being on here. I think it's been really great kind of following, what you were doing in Seattle and now kind of making this move back to New York and, getting to chase the kind of goals that you have now. So super happy for you and thank you for coming on. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Some of my takeaways from my conversation with Adam is that when we consider best case or worst case scenarios, we tend to unrealistically inflate how good or bad those scenarios can be. For Adam, his best case scenario of moving to New York City and suddenly having his life take off maybe wasn't the most realistic assessment. And his worst case scenario of his entire team at Microsoft disliking him for working remote was also unsubstantiated. Another thing I take away and something I want to re-emphasize from Adam is that at the end of the day, his heart wanted him to move back to New York City. And whether or not you added up the pros and cons and whether it made sense, what he really wanted to do was move back. And the way that I view that perspective is that I think it really gives him the best chance to succeed with his choice because his heart is really into it and he's going to be able to commit to the things that he wants. Finally, I really enjoyed how he talked about Adam broke his lease and had to pay the rent fee, and that motivated him to make the most out of New York City. because to me, that captures a key truth about decision making, which is that making the decision is the first small step. And it's also what you do and the actions you take after you decide to, say, move to New York that will really change your life for the better. So I'm really glad that Adam is following up his decision to move with intention and purpose. And I encourage everyone who's just made a big decision to do the same. If you're interested in sharing a decision you made with me, please feel free to reach out. You can find me at alexyang15.medium.com. That's alexyang15.medium.com. I'll also have the links in the Spotify episode.